Good morning. I hope that you're doing well. Have you ever realized when you read the Bible that there's a lot of parallels between Israel walking through the wilderness and us walking through this life? And when we look at Israel's journey, we will realize that one of the main problems that God had with Israel was that they were complaining a lot as they were going through the wilderness. And we need to understand some things about complaining. Now, first thing of all, when you're a child of God, we need to understand that all of the circumstances concerning our lives are regulated by God. When you become a child of God, there is a divine protection that covers your life, that if it is not God's will, some things will not and cannot happen to you. And often when we read the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy and maybe some of Numbers, we come to realize that God himself was testing the people along the journey. Would find that when Israel was positioned at the Red Sea with Pharaoh mighty army approaching them, it was all a part of God's plan to have victory over Pharaoh and his army. When they went into the wilderness and there was no water, it was a part of God's plan to test them. When we read Deuteronomy, it is said that I suffered you to hunger, that man might know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So we come to realize that during the journey in the wilderness, there were various tests that Israel was placed under to see how they would respond to the situations they faced. And similar to Israel, we too are tested in various ways. We are tested in based on what God might desire to pull out of us or what God might want to reveal about our character so that we can work on it. God allows us to go through various situations in life. Not everything a believer goes through in this life is positive. A lot of negatives happen. When the negative happens, it comes down to how are we going to process the negative that is taking place. How am I going to deal with the negative situations? Because when God tests us, the tests manifest first through situations. They manifest with circumstances that we are encountering. Some can be very challenging. Now, we're not going to debate how difficult or how extreme a test can get. If we should look at the life of Job, we'd find out that the circumstances and the events that were unfolding in Job's life during his test, it was permitted by God, and it got very intense. I mean, it was loss of family, loss of possession, loss of health. So God himself is not the instrument of our tests, but God permits us to be tested. However, he does say that you never allow us to be tested beyond where we can resist walking away from him. Now, my brothers and my sisters and those who are viewing online, we could get into the complications of these tests, and we could get to, I know a lot of persons might ask the why, but it's not the why. God has a purpose in each one of our tests. There's a video that I did about the sifting that we go through in order that we can become purer, and the sifting, God uses the devil as an instrument of a sift. So we won't go into that. But what we need to understand is our reaction to difficult circumstances. Now, when we look at Israel's journey through the wilderness, there are 3 stages when we are reacting negatively to a trial. Now, first of all, because trials generally play out in situations, it starts with situations. Before it deals with people, it's usually a situation. So even if it's going to be a trial between a child and his parent, a parent and a child, a husband and a wife, a person and their neighbor, it's usually a situational issue at first. It's usually the fact that, well, the child is coming home too late. So the situation that is causing the problems, the child is coming home too late, so that situation can be dealt with in a positive way or in a negative way. So whenever situations get tough, when we start to complain, it is usually the onset or the first domino the first domino to fall before the rest of dominoes start to fall. And there are three main dominoes that fall. The first is that when we start to complain about the situations in our life as if God is not sovereign, God is not omnipotent, God is not omniscient, He is omnipresent, He is not in control over all of our affairs. When we start to complain about the situation, it tends to trigger the opposite effect of purification. In fact, it starts to defile. And whenever a thing becomes defiled, it, instead of it pulling God closer to do purification work, it actually causes things to spread out. It's as if there's a cancerous cell, and it starts to spread out, because our reactions to trials and tribulation should not be one where which we are complaining, because complaining means that we put ourselves above God, and we are saying that God does not know what He's doing. God don't know what I do. Look how me I go through. Look how me not no money. Look how this give me problem. Look how my parents stay. Look how my spouse stay. So it's complaining about circumstances as if God is not enabling us to deal with the circumstances that we're experiencing. Now one might argue, especially if somebody is married, but wait, Pastor, I married this person before I got saved. So how can God be working in a situation that I went into before I came into a loving relationship with Him? Now, if you read the Bible, you'll find that the Bible makes provisions for these types of situation. And what we need to understand is that God is sovereign. That means God knows you are going to get saved before you get saved. So there is nothing that is happening whereby God is scratching His head and saying, how am I going to work out this situation? Now, of course, we're going to say that it's not as if things or situations are happening, and it's happening by persons doing things that they ought not to do, that we should not deal with these issues. It's not to say that if you're in an abusive relationship where your life is in danger, you should not deal with these situations. But what the Bible is trying to allow us to understand is that the concept of complaining, whereby it is that we murmur, we are grumbling, and sometimes we are grumbling about the situation, and why me, and why me can't bother with this, and this are just the worst. It's the approach to the negative circumstance which causes this bitterness and this negativity to start to spring up in us, and typically tends to spring over into the life of other persons. Because the trend based on theological studies show that when we are not dealing with situations well, we tend to start to pour this out on people or an individual. So within one's inner circle, one starts to pour out their frustration on somebody. With Israel, it was always Moses. Now imagine, Moses brought them into a wilderness, trying to help them, trying to deliver them out of Egypt. And whenever they went into difficult circumstances, the first thing they did was start to curse out Moses. So the situation, the bitter waters of Myra, the fact that they went 3 days without water, all of these things, because they were so frustrated about their situation, it moved from just being situational to personal. And you find that bitter people, persons who are going through difficulties in life, tend to want to become more isolated, push away some persons or an individual, blame individuals. Sometimes it's the government, sometimes it's the boss, sometimes it's the spouse, sometimes it's whoever it is, it's a picnic them. So bitterness moves from situations to persons. But it gets worse. It gets worse because studies have shown that whenever a believer starts to become very negative and toxic about the situations in life, they might say, "Boy, I made these choices and are the worst choice." When they start to become toxic about the situations, and it leads to them becoming toxic with persons, start to reject persons and contend with persons, all them and me can't bother with them. It tends to move from situations to person to God. And if you realize, most of the time when you have toxic persons, even within the church, they start off in the church and they start to become toxic about life. They start to complain about life and how things hard and nobody now help them or XYZ. Then it moves from the situations that they are facing as at the church, and the old hypocrite them, and we can't bother with them. And then after a while, it moves from the people or individual to God. Because ultimately, every believer knows something, so whether consciously or subconsciously, that God is sovereign enough to change your circumstance. So after a while, there's something deep down, that knows that no, the God that I read about in the Bible, He could make my situation better. He could make But he could change my circumstances. So after not coming to grips with the reality at first, that my situation, God has control over it. The persons in my environment, God have control over them. Eventually the person comes to the stage where they realize that no, God is a part of the problem and I'm no longer going to walk with God, because ultimately the truth is I got rid of the situation, or I complain about the situation, I got rid of the persons who were involved in the situation, but I still feel bitter, and the truth is the bitter against God. That's why sometimes we see persons walking who are no longer with the church, and you ask them what's happening. Boy, me can't bother, and me can't bother with them, pastor, and boy, the church and nothing for me. Why? They reject God because they did not deal with their tests, they did not deal with their trials in a way that was positive. Right? So there are positive ways. What are some of the positive ways that we can deal with trials? We can look at Job, for instance. When he lost everything, including his family and his wealth, the Bible says he worshipped God. I'm saying it takes some work to reach at that stage, but that is where we should push towards. That's the kind of, not that we're asking God to destroy our families, but I'm just saying we need to be able to deal with our situation by acknowledging first that God is sovereign. When things get negative, we need to say, no, God, you're sovereign, So first, what we're saying is that, God, you are still actively in control of my life, even though life has taken a very dramatic U-turn, or even though there are certain things that I desire that has not happened. God, you are still sovereign. You are still God over my life. You are still Lord over my circumstances. So there is a positive way to react to negative things, right? One of the ways is to worship God. As I said, we acknowledge that God is sovereign. We worship God. We bring the situation before Him, not in a mean by we are complaining, Lord God, and them God, and Lord Jesus, and them God. No, you go to God in a way where we're saying, God, you can still work out the situation. God, there's some good that you're working in this for me, and I'm believing you that despite what I'm going through, there's going to be something that benefits me at the end of this. So I'm trusting you, God, in my valley. I'm trusting you in my dry season. I'm trusting you in my desert season, that God, what the enemy means for evil, you are going to turn it around for good, because complaining is not going to change it. The best thing to do is to go to God. Go to God about the abuse. Go to God about the financial problems. Go to the God about the help that you think you need in your circumstance. Go to Him. Acknowledge who He is. Acknowledge what He can do. And if you put your trust in God, God will see you through. So let's put away the complaining and have faith that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Joseph, the God of Job is able to help you in your situation. God bless you. Reverend Kori Morris saying, have a blessed day.